Hey everybody, welcome back to our walkthrough of Rob Davis's book, Purpose and Form: The Necessary Basis of All Ethics. How are you doing today, Rob?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Excellent. We got some great weather here today. Took the doggo out and now we're ready to do a little mental stimulation.
Yep.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going through chapter 8. So this is episode 9 of our walkthrough. We are now dealing in chapter 8, the Christian ethic, faith, works in the world, purpose, integrity, and redemption. Rob, could you please give us kind of a general overview of what you were purporting in this chapter?
Yeah. So last time we talked about how we were doing part two of a pivot. Um, the last chapter was the second part of that pivot, and now we are fully in sort of the meat of part two, which is called uh, part two of the book, which is called A Return to Truth and a Solid Foundation for Life. So we've looked at nihilism and we've said, okay, that doesn't work. Then we need to look at things that might work. And so the goal of this chapter is to look at Christianity, and it's still written for that kind of modern person who um, is probably pretty skeptical of Christianity. Um, and but it's taking the tact of maybe there's something we could learn here. And the parts that I break it down to are the case that I make for these virtues in the world being, uh, at minimum, well established and well cultivated by Christianity, if not exclusively um, founded there. So the goal is to speak to that same sort of modern intellectual person who's troubled by nihilism, and to say, okay, regardless of all the problems you may have with religion, let's look at the fact that there are some positives that this practice brings to human life. And I make the case that at least some of them you can't really get anywhere else. You certainly can't get them in nihilism. So, so that's the overview of the chapter, and I have several sections where I talk about sort of how we might approach that understanding, and I hopefully do it in a way that is accessible to someone. That's not just, it's not a sermon written down. It's not the standard Christian fare, but again, it's trying to reach that person who is a product of the modern environment and has been affected by nihilism and likely finds the traditional perspectives not as helpful as they might be.
Excellent, excellent. Um, so one of the issues, one of the themes I think that a lot of modern intellectuals, modern people, just in general, face right now is a lack of faith. They just need something in front of them for them to believe in or to disregard. You open up the chapter discussing works and faith. What is there one kind of more important than the other? Can they work in tandem? And what is kind of the role of faith in finding your place in the world and your relationship with God?
Yeah, a lot has been said about faith throughout history, but also in modern times. I think a lot of the time we're sort of fighting the idea that faith just means I believe things without evidence, or I believe what I want to believe. And the problem is, there are some people who at least seem to act like that. So, but that gets inflated, and people start to think, well, that's just all of what Christianity is. And I do think that in terms of one over the other, I think they do work in tandem. I mean, within Christianity, it directly says faith without works is dead. So there's that implication there of they do go hand in hand. And even Martin Luther, who was sort of the I don't know, the pivot point at which we moved towards a much more the modern American Christianity where faith sort of takes preeminence much more. Even he is very clear about the fact that you need to do works in the world. That true faith is evidenced through works. So there's definitely a working in tandem, but I think it's worth noting, and I think pretty clearly that Christianity, insofar as there's a distinction between the two, they do put faith on the higher level. So that causes problems and has sort of been um, brought about. That discussion has been brought about to through maturity. Let's say there's sort of an established idea that, well, there's something wrong with the faith over works kind of idea, even though Christians have their own criticisms of that. There's still this notion that people don't like the faith over works idea. So I think there's a part of an answer to that, and part of it I address later in the book. But the tact I take in this chapter is looking at how they do work in tandem, and how even when you talk about solely faith, you are talking about something that has an effect in the world. It has causes, it does something, it does some work. So I end up quoting from Leo Tolstoy, who I think has a very good definition of faith. In fact, it's my favorite one that I've found. And I think it ties in with our whole idea of metaphysics being essential to discussion, and then metaphysics being the story that determines your mindset. So in that light, I'll read this quote. So Tolstoy says, "Faith is neither hope nor trust, but a particular spiritual state. Faith is man's awareness that his position in the world obliges him to perform certain actions. A person acts accordingly to his faith, not, as the Catechism says, because he believes in things unseen as things seen, nor because he wishes to achieve things hoped for, but simply because, having defined his position in the world, it is natural for him to act according to it. Just as the farmer tills the soil and the seafarer sails the seas, not, as the Catechism says, because they both believe in things unseen and hope to be rewarded for the activity. This hope exists, but it's not what guides them. But because they regard their activity as their vocation. Faith is man's conscious relationship with the infinite universe, from which he derives guidance for his activity." So there he's casting faith in the role of a job or a position, a vocation, where once I have taken this view that I am this kind of being in this kind of universe, that is, I am a follower of God in a universe that is created by, suffused by, and under the dominion of God, then that means I do certain things. So I like that point of view, because it sort of it cuts out the either or and goes straight to faith is something else. It's a state of being. It's a metaphysical assumption that you have. That you have, and then that determines your being. It determines your mindset, and then downstream from that determines your actions. And I think that's just a more direct reality than the modern response, where people tend to say, well, even scientists live based on faith. And I think that's all true. I think we all, as we said before, we have a metaphysical mindset. We have a story that determines our beliefs and therefore guides our actions. But I don't find that response to be very effective with people. They kind of just brush it off. Like, it's true that the scientists do function on faith, as Jordan Peterson's pointed out, their belief in the truth, that the truth will set you free, is like the cornerstone of the scientific faith. you might say, but even just the faith that our senses are reliable and that our reasoning capacities have some effect. Those are all things that are a priori axioms. They're assumed, they're a metaphysical assumption, and they're a faith. So that's all true. And maybe it's helpful for some people, but I haven't seen it be helpful for many people. They kind of are just like, well, religion's something different and something silly. So that's just sort of a word game that people are playing. Whereas when we talk about it like this, and we don't take the tact of, you know, everybody believes things that they can't prove, and therefore we should just leave it all alone, because that's not helpful either. So that those are some of the reasons why I like that definition.
Yeah, yeah, I really like that, especially that last sentence really hit home for me. Faith is man's conscious relationship with the infinite universe from which he derives guidance for his activity. There's I would view faith as being that perspective lens that we have and how we like you said how we view the world, and then that internal state of being is then projected out through our actions, our habits. And so I know it's kind of like a what came first, the chicken or the egg. There are a lot of
Right.
people that might be in a sense of depression. They might be going through, nihilism, a strong period of nihilism that might be their foundational belief. And so a lot of people would say, okay, well, maybe drink some water, go outside and get some sunlight, go work out, perform an action that kind of is the opposite of the state of being that you're in. And then you're going to, then hopefully over time, you fall into that state of being by performing the actions.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the other side is if you're in a strong state of well-being and you're living through faith, then you just naturally act that out through your habits, which I see as well. One of the main issues I think a lot of people face, which contradicts faith, is the mentality of instant gratification rather than delayed gratification. We expect, we order something at McDonald's, we expect it to be ready in 3 or 4 minutes. We want it right away. We if we don't have that validation to validate what we believe, if we don't get that in a time frame that we think is acceptable, then we disregard it or we move on. We don't think it works, and so that ties in with Tolstoy's quote here in kind of that the occupation. For instance, somebody sets sail. They have faith that they're going to reach the land that they are looking to attain, or you till the soil and you plant, you plant something and you expect to reap the crop within a certain time period. Um, and so I think a lot of people nowadays struggle with that by expecting instantaneous results. But if you were to hold that sense of faith in knowing, I am a child of God, or I am, I believe that we are going to reach the promised land, that that alters and sets the foundation of your entire worldview, and every action then that you project out into the world is based off of that belief set. And so that to me is where the problem is with nihilism, because then there is no faith, there is no meaning, there is no purpose. Therefore, you don't have that deep well of faith to draw upon to help propel you in a positive way. Um, Next, you talk about faith and grace. What is the difference between faith and grace?
Well, the I bring it up as a little bit of an aside, just to say that people have sort of the same problem that they have with faith being emphasized over works. They have that with grace over works or man's will or whatever it is. It's sort of this. It's almost exactly the same problem. I mean, um, the there's a difference in that faith is generally considered something that is predominantly on the side of the believer, whereas grace is something that's on the side of God. Um, but in this case, they function in the same way um, where the grace of God is said to be sort of the prime actor and the thing that allows, all of our efforts at working alongside come to actual fruition. It's sort of God that sets the stage, God that allows that cooperation to happen, and then God who um, makes us creatures who are capable of cooperation. So, uh, but it comes around to the same point where sort of people worry about faith because it can breed inactivity or just sort of a complacent attitude. And then on the other side, people worry about the doctrine of grace for the same reasons. They think that um, if people, if it's all put on God, if God's sort of the primary one uh, responsible, more or less, then that'll bring about the same complacence. So it's just an echo of the same problem, at least through this lens, though they are different. Faith is for the person's mindset, the story that determines the person's mindset and how they see themselves, and then their actions, and then grace is the activity of God.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So there is that difference between grace and faith. Um, would you say that the initial invitation would then come from the individual to harbor that faith, then to accept the grace from God? Or do you think that God could supplies his grace to the faithless as well?
I think I know what you're saying, but could you say it again?
Yep. So coming from the point of faith being kind of the individual, kind of the human aspect, and then God brings his grace upon those that have faith. My question would be, and I think of let's say David, for example, in the Bible in the Old Testament, who didn't necessarily do everything that God had asked him to do. There were certain things that he did that many modern Christians would probably say weren't very good, but nonetheless, God supplied David with his grace. Would you say that's in general that God supplies grace to people, even those that don't have faith, or do you think that those that kind of live in a Christ-like fashion that follow Christ, then is kind of the initiating aspect for then God to bring that grace down upon those that have faith?
Yeah, I see. So I mean, it's a little bit of both. I think the traditional answer that we are well accustomed to in like the Western, especially Protestant world, is that it's all God's grace and it's God's grace before everything else. But um, part of the problem is that we're thinking of things in sort of a linear order, and we're thinking about what comes first, meaning time wise, like do I do my action first or does God do his action first? But God is not a being bound by time. So assuming that time applies to him giving grace and he only gives it like at this certain period after or before something is, I think, just a non-existent reality. Like that's it's the frame in which it's presented is preventing uh, a perception of what's actually going on. And so, um, and then to hypothesize without, oh, well, if we look at God's side without time, then we're just shooting in the dark, sort of. So you could speculate that, well, God sort of is always um, sending out his grace, and then we experience it in varying times in our lives. But I think that I like that description, but I have no way of knowing whether that is the reality or not. And so the question is right from the perspective that we are always going to look from our perspective, and so um, it's just we tend to take the question a little bit uh, literally and mechanically and think that it says something about God, but really we're saying something about our experience as humans, and we have a time bound experience. And I would say that I think that there have been people who have experienced it either way. Some people will sort of be called to action, and you might say, well, that call itself is the initial grace. Maybe, again, it's sort of splitting hairs, like where do you draw the line? What's God's grace? What's not? But um, some people will lead with action and then come to believe, as we were talking about earlier, like sometimes you have to enact a new habit in the hope that your mindset will change through being exposed to that different style of life. I think that is true, and I think that has worked for some people. Other people have the mindset shift first, which you might call a grace that just sort of like comes out of nowhere. It's just an insight or a moment of clarity that's bestowed on you through nothing that you can sort of point to of like, I was cultivating this or I was asking for this or whatever. It just sort of happens. And then from that point, their activity reorients itself. So I don't know that I don't think there's an answer to like, from our perspective, which is the only perspective that it's appropriate to think about this, what came first. It's kind of, it depends on the person and depends on the activities of their life. And I don't think that either side, is an untenable position that says something, you know, makes a problem with theology or God's goodness or anything like that. So I think you can go either way.
Yeah, I guess the example that came to mind was, and I don't mean to butcher this story. I know it vaguely. But that would be the story of Daniel who initiated a 21-day fast, and then the angels came down and had to fight. It took 21 days because they had to fight the principalities of the nation then to, in order to get to Daniel. So it took those 21 days. So it took that initiation of Daniel beginning the fast, the act of beginning the fast, to then start the voyage of the angels to come down to give a message to Daniel, and then that message then could be looked at as being the grace of God through the knowledge that the angels were bringing. But then it was initiated by through the action. I guess that would be the works for then him to receive the grace. So, but I absolutely see the fact that it's time is essentially a man-made construct, and is, although we might agree that there is a specific time in the day, we can look at our phones or we can look at a clock and we can agree, okay, it's 5:30, it's 3:30. But then we all experience time individually. It's relative to the individual, depending upon which activity that individual is engaging in. Sometimes, for me, I mean, the day might have dragged out forever, but I might have had an incredibly boring day, as opposed to you, who might have had an incredibly uh, fun-filled day. Went to Disneyland. I don't know, you went to a buffet and you were really in the zone and it just flew by. So that's, I guess, a different discussion on kind of the craziness of time. I do want to talk about the next thing I wanted to bring up is causality and its relation to the Bible. Um, you bring up, if I'm looking here correctly, give me 1 second. Trying to figure out which page that was on.
It starts on 179 and then
Oh, yep. Yep. So you say, I propose is the root of human belief, which is demonstrated in the Bible as well as pretty much everywhere else. Again, this is our universal truth. The universal truth is causality. Could you please touch on causality and its importance and relativity to the Bible?
Yeah, so I think that this approach is again uh, trying to appeal to that modern intellectual, because from the sort of scientific perspective, what we're going after is discovering the mechanisms of causality. And I think that there's sort of like there's a well duh level to that, but I think there's a deep level to it. And I think that it's helpful to see that in the biblical stories, as in essentially any story, any story that works and lasts a long time, there's going to be this underlying common understanding that we are in a world of partially comprehensible causality. And I say partially comprehensible from the scientific point of view, where we just recognize we don't understand everything. And then from the biblical point of view, the people also did not understand, why things happened at certain times and how exactly. And some people thought you could propitiate local pagan gods to get the rain, and some people thought that you could sacrifice babies and get something out of that. And Israel was convinced throughout many times of their history that if you were slaughtering the bull just right and doing exactly the way the Torah says, then God had to do what you wanted him to do. And so we look at that now and we sort of have the lens of, well, those stupid people, they didn't know anything about real causality, because otherwise they wouldn't be doing such silly things. But I think it's important to note that they were acting with some, even if we think it's erroneous, some sort of belief in causality, that they were seeking to participate in the web of causation that exists in the world throughout the entire universe, and to participate in it in a way that was functional and allowed them to flourish and experience a life of the least amount of toils and sorrows and the most amount of prosperity. So I think from that lens, we can sort of achieve a much more broad and understanding of these were human beings ultimately fulfilling the same quest that we're trying to fulfill now, of participating in causation in an effective way to get the things that we are after. And I think that that goes a lot deeper than we normally suppose, because most people aren't really wowed by the fact that, oh, look, I pour water in a cup and now there's water in a cup. Like, whatever. That just seems silly. But even the smallest A causes B, is connected to, it's a concrete thing that we take for granted, but it's one small part of the entire web of causation that we do not understand. So what we do each day is interact in things that we consider totally run-of-the-mill, everyday, just not interesting whatsoever. But I think it is profoundly interesting. I think it has profound implications that we are able to live and affect causes in this world where we are not the what would you say? We are not the authors of all causality. Some like we are subject ourselves to causality. Causality is something that is superior to us. And yet we're part of it and we're subject to it. And at the same time, we participate in it. We originate causes out of ourselves and put them out in the world to get certain effects. And again, that just like, well, duh. But what I think this says is that there is a, this is how I put it in the book. From this perspective, uh, talking about the unknown overarching law of causation, which is supreme, we don't necessarily think that the causation that we understand is exactly the same, and we understand all of it, and it's just that spread out to the ends of the universe. A few scientists maybe think that, but for the most part, even most scientists don't believe that we know all of the fundamental laws of causality, even in the physical sense. So, and there are ways that might vary in different locations of the universe, even possibly. So, so we have this mystery. We have this mysterious reality that extends beyond our knowledge that we are nevertheless part of and capable of interacting with on our scale. And so I think what that means is that we do believe that there is an order, not that we know the order, but that there is an order and that things do proceed causally everywhere, and that we have been able to see and come to know what we have been able to see and come to know here is a derivation of that underlying broader truth, and that we wouldn't be able to operate by these minuscule infallible rules of causation that we have already understood if causation were not true fundamentally of creation of the universe as a whole. So the point is, regardless of the accuracy or completion of our map, our understanding, we do believe that there's a territory, a mappable, not necessarily perfectly by us, underlying structure. So this belief in causality is something that is mysterious and beyond us and transcendent in a way, and yet we participate in it. And this is really the foundation of science. And at the same time, I think it's almost, if not directly, a mystical reality that we experience every day and just overlook.
Yeah, I see that. So causality is similar to, or it is, if this, then that. You know, you provide an input and then you get an output. So if I touch a hot stove, I'll burn my hand. Um, and that's kind of that's how humans progress, right? It's like we're fumbling in the dark trying to see what works. If somebody, somebody's got to eat the poisonous berry to find out it's poisonous.
Hmm.
And somebody's standing on the side saying, all right, I'm taking note, we're not going to eat that berry anymore.
Right.
And I guess that order, kind of that underlying order to everything is, okay, I know that my hand can't go through this book or it can't go through the wall. I can press up against it. Um, and that's because of the atomic structure, the molecular structure of whatever it is that we're pressing up against. But if everything was just so incredibly random and chaotic and there was no order, uh, we could do whatever we want. I mean, it would be a complete free for all dream state. Okay, well, we could put our hand through walls. You know, we could do just incredible things that we can't even necessarily conceive of. But we can't do that because there is that foundational order that permeates all things. And that figuring out what the lines are with that order allows us to naturally progress by making mistakes by being fallible, making mistakes, learning from the mistakes, and then becoming more efficient. And that's true progress, not necessarily boys can be girls and girls can be boys, as a lot of people think being progressive is, but the true nature of progression is then learning from the mistakes. And I guess that old adage of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, because that strength comes from the knowledge of learning from those mistakes. So then you can cross certain things off. Okay, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this, but we can do this. And then some things are meant to be broken though as well, right? So people,
Yeah.
okay, well, it's impossible for somebody to run a 4 minute mile until somebody does it. And then the floodgates are open and people, just very quickly start breaking that record. So a lot of it is our mental limitations, our limitations that we impose on ourselves and thinking that there are certain things that we can't do. But then there are definitely much more, I guess, acute senses of order in that you can't breathe underwater. I mean, well, I take that back. You can if you're a scuba diver. Again,
Right.
we've made that progression to be able to do it, but initially, no, you can't breathe underwater. Um, that kind of brings me into, I guess kind of the hubris of humanity, some aspects in thinking where pride comes in and thinking that we just know everything. Um, that is very far from the truth. For instance, our very limited sense of perception via our five senses is very small on the spectrum of perception. For instance, radiation. We can't see radiation. Radiation can go through us, and it causes incredibly detrimental effects on us, but we can't see it. As opposed to Indiana Jones can see the boulder coming at him, he can run out of the way. You can see that. So having that mindset, that we know everything or we can know everything is detrimental to the progression of humanity in general. Um, I wanted to talk to you about the reliance on God as a placeholder to the unknown and that relation to the infinite. So there's actually a quote that you bring up, incredible quote, kind of very eye-opening, from Harari. We give our ignorance the grand name of God. Could you kind of touch on that as to kind of those known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and the idea that at some point we're going to be able to attain enough knowledge to make God irrelevant?
Yeah, yeah, that's sort of the common view. Well, I don't know how actually common, but it's been a popular um argument and what would you say, detraction from God when you call God the God of the gaps. Is like, well, when we just don't understand something, then we ascribe it to God. And that has been true of things that people have done in the world. But the irony is that the assumption that that's the case implies, well, eventually we're going to know everything and we will have no need for God because it'll all just be stuff that we could have explained if we knew better. Well, that assumes that reality is finite and we could know it all, which is, even if we assume that reality is finite, it's still an incredible amount of arrogance to believe that we could know everything about all of reality because it's enormous. Um, so so there's that perspective on the God of the gaps. And then I think that what I try to do is show that actually this is appropriate the appropriate mental attitude is we are part of a world that we don't completely understand, and yet we have to engage with it and try to act in a effectively causal way. And we have to try to figure out how to do that even better next time. And the idea that there is a reality out there that's beyond me, that's bigger than me, that's superordinate to me, that I can never grasp all of. And yet I'm called to act faithfully, we might say. I mean, that's you might just say you're called to act. Like, here we are in the world. We don't understand it all, but we got to go put water in a cup and drink it. Like, we're sort of just thrown into the midst of it. So the idea that there's a larger reality than you that you're never going to completely understand is just the straightforward reality, and is simply humble. Now, so I think that is the far weightier and more important side of that to actually realize. And the God of the gaps thing, like, yes, it's true that some people would uncritically perform that sort of pattern of thinking, and that they probably aren't the thought leaders that, you know, we should be following. Like, fair enough. But we also shouldn't be following the thought leaders who believe that they can know everything, and that the world is finite and that they're going to conquer it with their minds. Like, that's not a good sign either. So, um, so this view of the world is actually just straight up in line with the idea that the universe is infinite. And let's say since we've already gone over that in chapter 1, and I think it's a provable fact. It's at least provable that a finite universe is logically inconsistent and doesn't work. Since reality, life, the universe, whatever you want to say, is infinite, since existence is infinite, then we are always, this is a quote from David Deutsch, we're always just scratching the surface with our knowledge. No matter if we end all of our silly disputes and just get totally on board with the scientific method, and we do amazing things and we learn, more than we could ever dream of, and we go at that for millions and trillions of years. Even at that point, all of everything that humanity learned, even if it couldn't be encapsulated by one human mind, would still be just scratching the surface of an infinite universe. So the idea that there's an infinite reality beyond us that we're not going to know, that's just reality. And what I think this brings us to is that the universe, or existence, whatever you want to call it, life itself, is knowable. We can know for certain as a mystery. It is certainly a mystery, and it will always be a mystery. So we're always in the state of being in the midst of a mystery that nevertheless includes us and calls us to participate in it. And what's up with that? That's crazy. That's amazing. That's kind of scary. That's all these things. But one thing that it's certainly not is unintelligent to recognize that fact and say, yeah, there's an infinity of life out there beyond me that I don't understand and I'm not going to understand. Now, you could criticize it a little bit and say, well, that doesn't give you the excuse to just write off anything you don't understand as the action of God. And of course not. But some people are going to do it, and some people, like, it's not that big of a deal as long as some other people are trying to figure it out and doing so effectively and humbly, and then we learn through them. And the people who were just like, whatever, it's a God thing. Okay, they weren't the leaders of scientific thought at their time. That's fine. Not everybody has to be the leader of us. Not everybody can be the leader of scientific thought. So I think that attitude is enormously overstated, that there's this, like, God of the gaps is like this ultimate argument against God. Well, not at all, unless you think that reality is finite, which is a silly thought. So maybe you should reconsider that. And then once you understand that reality is infinite, then Obviously, we're going to be ignorant about tremendous amount of things, and yet we understand that there is a ordered procession of events that is having significant effects that we notice around us. And I don't see why you couldn't call that an aspect of God.
Yeah. Yeah, I always think of, for instance, the flood, or Tower of Babel, or Sodom and Gomorrah. Whenever humanity gets to a certain point, whether it's through pride, or harboring a reprobate mind, or some other sinful nature, man is always humbled. Man is always reminded that God exists. Um, it seems like every time humanity climbs over a ledge and thinks that they've reached the top, it is only until they realize and find the next ledge that needs to be climbed, the next wall that needs to be climbed. Um, it's it's only through that overarching relationship between faith and works, and faith and grace, walking with God through that progression of humanity, that true progress can be made. Otherwise, it's just illusory. We progress to a point in thinking, okay, well, we don't need God, we don't need faith, we can do everything on our own. That something then catastrophic happens, because humanity always has a tendency to trip up if it's not combined with that humility, and with that knowing, that causality, that causal knowing that you know if we engage in these activities, there's going to be a downfall. Or if we try to achieve a certain level of progress without that relationship with God, without walking in that faith, then it's going to capitulate, and it's going to fall. There's one really excellent quote that you have here on page 182. Today, some intellectuals believe that we will eventually gain knowledge of everything, so we do not need to rely on God. That is to say, that since we have learned so much, and our reach has extended back to near the Big Bang and to the horizon of our universe, we can expect to fill in all the gaps and eventually understand the thing in itself of the creation. And then our previous ignorance and the worshipped unknown will be proved only to have been a superstition that was holding us back. And I think that is always the driving factor of man, to separate from God and try to achieve things on their own, uh, which has a tendency to never properly work. There's always a reminding that God is in control, that there is an infinite,
Mhm.
regardless
Yeah.
of how many times we try to convince ourselves that we are the masters of reality, and of a finite reality. Um,
So on the note of that, that pride and that overreaching of the intellect, let's just talk a little bit more about
yeah,
later in that section. There's also this idea today that I think just passes unnoticed, is the belief in fundamental randomness. And this comes up in the the I think, as we talked about, the faith-based assertion that everything started randomly. That's not a scientific hypothesis. That's just a story tacked on to the beginning of the evolutionary story. Um, Saying, oh, it started randomly, whatever that means. Uh, and that everything's random, everything's just chaotic. There's no real order. All the order is just imagined. So the problem here is that this is, I mean, this is a completely unfounded theory. It's just, it's a, excuse me, it's a faith. It's because in order to postulate true randomness the way that these people are, you actually have to know everything. So because you have to distinguish between chaos that we perceive, which might have some order, but we are just incapable of understanding, and true chaos or true randomness, which is something that truly follows no plan that no consciousness would ever be able to understand because it doesn't have a plan. It doesn't have any real order. And this fundamental assumption of randomness is key to all these ideas. It you can't just say, oh, it's something we don't yet understand, because then you wouldn't actually be appealing to random cause. You would be appealing to a superior mind that understands things that look chaotic to us. So, but the problem is, we like, this is a superstition. Like, how would you prove that randomness exists? The only way to do it would be to know for certain that no one could find a pattern in this thing. So you have to declare yourself all knowing in order to say there's definitely no pattern here. This is definitely fundamentally random. So this is a superstition. This is a faith. This is just a just so story. Oh, it's just random. It just happened. Um, and this is a common appeal that scientists make today, is like, oh, well, things are just random. The causality just sort of peters out at some point. Like, it's kind of here and we notice it, but it's just, in the end, it's all the law of entropy wins and everything's just fundamentally random. They use some, fancy terms, and they back it up with their degrees, and but at the end of the day, they're declaring something that's unknowable as a certainty. The only way you could know it is if you knew everything. And I think there's a bit of dramatic irony there. Is like, this is extreme. Excuse me. This is extremely uh, arrogant. It's an extremely arrogant belief because it depends on you knowing everything. And I think there is an arrogance there going on where people just accept this blandly, like, oh yeah, of course, fundamental randomness. Why not? Well, there's a lot of reasons why not, but for one, how could you possibly know? So, uh, fundamental chaos is not a falsifiable theory. It is a faith and a dogma, and it's a metaphysical belief about the core nature of life, which extends beyond our knowledge. Yet we choose to conceive of it in a certain way, which orients our actions and attitudes in life. And a lot of people are choosing the path of being like, oh yeah, there's all that stuff out there that I don't understand, but it's definitely all random. And I know that somehow. So then I think once we see that and to see the absurdity of it, then it becomes much more tenable and much more wise and humble just to come back to the biblical view, where we're experiencing an infinity that proceeds beyond us that we do not understand. That's true. But we notice some level of causality that we can comprehend, and we are called to act in a causal way, and that seems to have some effect. So we're participating in this mysterious infinite that has causality to some degree embedded in it, and that involves itself in our lives and saturates our lives, really. And yet we have to be effective, and yet we don't understand what's going on. And so there's this humbling reality of, this is the superordinate reality that's beyond me, but yet somehow I'm a part of it, and somehow I get to play a part in it, and I'm invited to participate in it. And I think that is a far healthier and a far more productive perspective than the nonsensical modern ones that pass themselves off as high standards of science.
Right. It's what came to mind as well with the unknowns. As soon as we think that we know everything, it's like trying to dig a hole in water. As soon as we think we have a grasp on it, those unknowns just fill it right back up. Um, so it's essentially just a loss of effort to hold that belief system that we can know everything. And I think the difference as well between order and chaos is if we think that everything is absolutely random and there's no order to anything, we wouldn't be able to realize that unless we could look at order and say, okay, this is order, and if this is order, then this is chaos. If everything was just random and chaotic, I don't think we would have the ability to conceptualize what order looks like.
Well, we
And
also
whether
just wouldn't exist, but
we wouldn't
yes.
exist, and we wouldn't exist. But I mean, we can act out order. You know, if a shrub or a bush grows unruly, we can prune it. We mow our lawns, we clean certain things up, we get things in order, and that intrinsic drive for order, I don't think is random either. I think that that is then working through us because God is order. God is order and chaos, and uh, the the I guess the commandment or that God gave Adam after the fall was that he is to till the land. He is to make that order, to be kind of that arbiter of order for God in the world, to tame everything. And that's kind of the story of humanity, right? Is we are the flashlight in the darkness trying to make the order out of things. And so it's just a lost effort to just assume that everything is random and chaotic, when I think fundamentally the very basis of existence is order. Like you said, we wouldn't exist if there wasn't order.
Right.
um
And most people come to that conclusion through an ordered investigation of reality.
right, through an ordering of thoughts and an investigation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. um that the next point that I wanted to bring on, which I think ties into what is knowable and what isn't in man's, I guess, empty attempt at trying to know everything, is on page 182. You state that the universe is knowable as a mystery, and then you touch on the great mystery. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah. So I think this is something really deep and worth dwelling on is that we can know. It's kind of a paradox because a mystery is something that you don't know, but it's kind of like saying we can know that we don't know.
Hmm.
We can know that we're in a state of not knowing. Um, and that we're perpetually in that state since life is infinite. But so that means that one thing we can know is that life is a mystery, and we will always be surrounded by and engaging in this mystery. And I think that just has, you know, people might find it a bit vague or woo woo or whatever, but I think it has a profound effect, just sort of adjusting almost the flavor, if you will, of how we look at life. Of our our primary experience is one of engagement with a mystery, um, and I don't know how you. Excuse me. I mean, the only way to deny that is to say that you know everything. So, like, well, it's obviously true, but we so rarely uh I think we so rarely go through life with that intimate understanding of I am engaged in mysteriously productive relationships with the infinite mystery. And that I think the more that we grasp that, the more that life becomes a constant adventure, becomes a wonderful unfolding drama, it becomes captivating in every facet. And I think that is just acknowledging that truth is a way to bring vitality back to life, to see life in a more vivid and fully colored way rather than just being like, oh, I'm this weird late stage postmodern human wandering around in the wasteland of progress and things don't mean anything, and we've figured stuff out, and there's nothing for me to explore, and things are boring, and I'll just pass my life, getting kicks on online content or whatever. I think that is completely done away with and superseded when you really let this sink in, that we're in the midst of an infinite mystery, and we we're constantly involved with things that we don't understand. And so I think it's night and day different, really.
Yeah, it's like if I can remember correctly, the Socratic quote is the more that I know, the more I realize I don't know anything. Um, and I think that by thinking that we know everything, that clearly produces stagnation because there wouldn't be a drive to achieve anything else. It's like if an athlete, the main goal is to achieve a certain number in something or to achieve a trophy, once that trophy is achieved, what then is the next drive for attainment? As opposed to the goal of being the best every time and any time that you engage in that activity, regardless of whether or not you're validated through a trophy or a specific number. There have been many instances where athletes kind of get into a sense of or a state of depression and uh, I guess loss because once certain things are achieved, they haven't thought, well, what's next after that? Um, and then touching on causality and its direct relation to order, there would be absolutely no causality without that sense of order because you have to rely on the order for that progress. I mean, if if that burning stove or that oven top or that stove top is hot and you touch it, you're going to get burned. So there's order in the fact that a hot stove top will lead to a burning hand if you touch it. If it was completely random, there would be then maybe sometimes that you would be burned with the hot stove top and sometimes not. It's a
Right.
random, but it fully relies on the order of and consistency of if I perform this action, I'm going to get this result. And to me, that is you cannot refute that because that's the very foundation of reality to grow in and to progress with is always through that order, through that causality. What's the next thing? How
Mhm.
do we continue to grow? And the great mystery is knowing that we don't know and how do we continue to achieve and attain that there's always a sense of wanting to improve as opposed to stagnate. And again, as with the prior example, stagnation comes from a lack of direction, a lack of or a sense of knowing everything. Well, if we know everything, then there's nothing else to achieve, therefore stagnation ensues. um and I want to talk then, and that ties in with progression and causality and always wanting to achieve and to understand more. And that is working effectively and ethically with the Lord. So how does efficiency and engaging ethically in certain things, how does that tie in with the relationship with God and just um progression with humanity in general?
Yeah. So I think that I use the word effectively, not efficiently. You could call them synonyms in some
Oh,
cases, but just to be clear, because efficiency, uh, I think the most ready understanding of it is about getting things done quickly. And you could argue that the most efficient way is also the most effective way because you want to be quick, but you also don't want to be so quick that you mess things up. But I think that just cutting away from that issue and saying I'm not just interested in the short term quickest results. I'm interested in what's actually effective over the long run, which I think will ultimately end up being the most efficient. But so working effectively uh, is something that, and this is sort of what we were building up to, is something that humans have always been interested in figuring out. What's the effective way to do this? What's the effective way to rule a state? What's the effective way to bring down a deer? What's the effective way to power someone's travel? And then what's a more effective way, and what's a more effective way, and how do we improve on that? So there's, I think it's interesting because this mindset generally is sort of viewed on as sort of a mechanical and unethical mindset of just let's be as effective as possible. Let's become machines, and sort of the what turn of the previous century German workforce mindset of just conquer through hard work and mathematics and precision. And I don't think that I don't want to portray that, but I'm playing with the juxtaposition that we tend to equate between what's effective and what's ethical. I think what we realized as humans, and part of what Christianity points out, if not a core of what Christianity points out, is that ethics are a core part of being actually effective, not short-term effective, not locally effective, but truly effective, universally effective. And to some degree, this just comes naturally from once we truly uproot the idea that our consciousness is insignificant, and once we realize that life is infinite and our consciousness is in some way part of and connected to the infinite, then our conscious states are incorporated within infinite reality. So ethics are not a human imposition. They are actually part of working effectively in the world. But I try to make a more sterile case, you might say, for the fact that what we have found throughout history is that even though it's sort of counterintuitive, even though it might start off looking backwards, when you act ethically, you end up over the long run being way more effective than anything else. And I think this plays out in game theory. Most people would be aware, just sort of the basic thing around which modern game theory is built is the tit for tat, where you are counting, you are noticing transgression and marking it. So you are trying to implement justice. You are not just letting people behave unethically with no punishment, but you are also being merciful, forgiving, and charitable, and you don't continually punish someone who starts doing better. And then your basic fundamental orientation is to cooperate, and that setup of tit for tat with a lean towards mercy is the most effective strategy in game theory. So I think that something that I don't know, we overlook or we take for granted is that within the Christian story, there is this story of coming out of a world where people just basically did whatever they wanted. If they didn't want their babies, they just dumped them in the city trash heap. If they wanted to beat and or rape their slaves, they did. People just acted however suited them. And then Judaism sort of started the process of saying, no, you're not going to live by that. Here's a bunch of things that you can't do, and you have to hold yourself apart from the world. And they did that mostly horribly fallibly and didn't really follow the rules or followed them in a ridiculous literal way that allowed them to still do whatever they want, but look like they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. And then Christ and Christianity came along and lived it out and demonstrated that the law of the universe is love. And then the movement that was started with these people who you would never pick as like the most effective people in history, these poor, uneducated fishermen, took over the world. And excuse me. So I think it is sort of demonstrated in history that what is profoundly effective, more effective than we could ever have imagined, is to operate ethically. Yes, we're going to do it fallibly. Yes, there's going to be horrible blemishes on that record, but even still, that's going to get us way farther than anything else. And I was just reading in Dominion by Tom Holland, one of the, I think the third emperor after Constantine, who made the nation Christian. He was raised Christian, and then he departed from Christianity, and he was trying to restore the pagan temples. And he went around and he was like, "Hey, you guys gotta, buck up your game. Like, you got to get people back coming to temple. And what you should do is give charity to the poor and support the poor. That's what you're supposed to be doing." So it's like he was really mad at Christianity, but his understanding of how to get people and how to be effective was basically to be a Christian.
Very
And
Christian of him. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And he's trying to revamp these temples. Like the whole point of the pagan temple is that you're supposed to be able to bribe these limited supernatural beings so you get protection and wealth and whatever else, and that they don't care about your ethical conduct and you can go do whatever you like because you've given the proper bribes at the proper time. Whereas Christianity is supposed to be the opposite, where you cannot bribe God. You have nothing that God needs. And you are invited to be a part of a heavenly kingdom if you how would we say this? If you work your hardest to try to become the kind of person who could live in a heavenly kingdom. That sort of puts on the work side of the faith thing, but and some people might not like that, but I think that's still the case. And it's not like you could ever do enough works to merit inheriting infinity. That's impossible to earn. So it's always a gift of grace, and your works aren't earning you heaven. It's your works are transforming you into the kind of being who can live in a heavenly kingdom. And it's still always God that has provided that opportunity and has made you the kind of being who could participate in that transformation. So anyhow, I think that the idea of effectiveness, of being the most effective we can be, far from being this dry, mechanistic, scientific, modern nihilist view, is actually a good call to follow. We just have to be discerning. We have to grasp the fact that effectiveness is tied to ethics. Ethics are part of being effective. And I think that part of the reason we've lost that is because we have this nihilist mindset that our consciousnesses are aberrations that don't have anything to do with reality, and we're just imposing all of our vague desires. Whereas the reality is our consciousnesses are a significant part of infinite reality, and they are part of what is accounted for and what needs to be accounted for in acting. So So once you get rid of that nihilist idea that my consciousness is insignificant and this aberration and doesn't mean anything, which we've discussed before, then it's very evident and obvious that ethics is part of acting appropriately in the world and causing good effects.
I completely agree with you in that the most effective way to progress and it would be to have that win-win mentality. If we are living in a do as thou wilt, me, I don't care what happens to the other person as long as I get what I want. That's complete disharmony and it's one-sided and typically always ends in ruin or some form of unfair control or advantage. It's always the win-win, you get what you want, I get what I want, and we're in harmony and we both prosper together. That does seem to be the most effective way. And that also ties in with being ethical because you're caring about what the other person does. You're acting out in a specific guideline or framework where there's prosperity and abundance for everybody involved. Now quickly I do want to touch on the works and faith just again because you had brought that up. A lot of times I feel that works could be extremely superficial, where people would just act out certain things and hope that, okay, well, as long as I'm engaging in the action of what I'm doing, then I will reap the reward of gain of reaching the promised land or getting into heaven. Uh, and that action, that just desire of performing the actions is separate than what is on your heart. If your heart is filled with the presence of God, and then that presence in your heart propels you to engage in certain activities and certain works that then would gain you hopefully entrance into the kingdom uh, through those works. But I think that if you were to just engage in the works without the faith, then I mean I can't necessarily say, but I would make the assumption that that would be kind of a void. It's almost like engaging in certain activities because you want to appease society or those around you. You're not doing it because you want to do it, but you're doing it so that other people will view you in a specific way. So I think that's where that strong foundation of having that faith comes in tandem with cooperation with the works. Um, that brings me to another question based on our discussion of acting effectively and ethically, and that is what is and you proposed this question as not yourself, but I think that those that would question your point of view is what if it is immoral to be efficacious?
Yeah, so this is a modern idea, and I don't know that anyone specifically said it in this way, but I think it adds up to a lot of what we see today. So particularly in the sort of environmental movement, the idea is that human activity is in itself wrong or it usurps the right of nature, whatever it is. So we have to realize, and I don't think anyone can deny that we are efficacious. We cause effects in the world. That's a given. And then it's also true, I think, that we do so in order to live, to pursue our desires. We try to input certain effects to get certain results. So we're not just acting as part of causation. We are choosing which causes to input. So we're an origination of cause as well. So that puts us in this sort of special category. And then that's where I think the modern distorted lens comes in and goes, well, what if we're these weird, broken, wrong beings who shouldn't be acting this way, and we're just animals, but we figured out the trick and now we're messing everything up because whatever. Well, the reality behind that is we are causal, we are effective, and we are ignorant and fallible. That's all true. We and that's dangerous because if you're effective, if you have the ability to input effects, including some relatively powerful effects like we do, then and you're ignorant, which we are, and you're fallible, which we are, then you are going to be engaging in causation in a less than optimal way. So that's going to have serious negative ramifications. That's all just true and a given, and we share those points up to this point. And that's sort of where that modern conception builds off. Like, well, maybe it's all just bad, and we shouldn't be doing this at all, and we shouldn't even exist at all. Back to the sort of antinatalist point and nihilist point. Well, the issue comes up here in that we have decided that we're effective. Okay. So then the question really is, can we ever act towards the good? Can we ever act for good? Are we effective? We are effective. Can we be effective towards the good? And this is a really revealing question because I am not saying, and you shouldn't be asking, whether there's sort of a binary choice of either humans are all good all the time or all bad all the time. The question that I'm posing is there any reality, any hope that humans could work alongside the good for whatever amount of time, could do some good action? Is there some amount of goodness and or redemption present in human nature? Or is it absolutely the case that humans have no ability to work towards the good? And the scary thing is a lot of people are choosing the latter option and have this hypothesis that we're just evil beings. Like what a ridiculous view that you have all the options of, like, sure, human beings could be horrible and we're doing everything terribly and all that, but we still could believe, as long as we still believe there's a potential for goodness within humans, that's fine. We can work with that. But if you have this dogmatic belief that human action is just inherently evil, then that's a problem. And it's a problem for yourself, because then again, it's the same thing. It's fundamental meaningless. Like, why are you talking to me then? Because even if you convinced me that you were right and the humans were evil, the only thing that could come out of that action is evil by your own definition. So everybody really in reality believes that there's an ability for humans to at least reform themselves so that they are being less bad. And everyone absolutely believes that the truth is involved with that, because people trying to spread the truth that humans are evil have the hope that people would recognize that truth and act accordingly with it, which would then be good, although a very distorted kind of good, but from their point of view, good. So what that means is that we all agree that humans can work towards the good, that redemption is possible, and that coming into contact with and humbling yourself before the truth is the way to get on the side of the good. Now, people disagree on what that truth is, but that's the fundamental formula of we're effective whether we like it or not. There is hope that we can work towards the good. We are mostly not working towards the good, or at least partially not working towards the good. Therefore, we need to see what the good is, and turn around and act in accordance with the good. So everyone actually accepts those premises. even though their sort of higher order dogmas would try to deny them. That's the formula that everybody's already acting through. And because if you didn't have that formula, again, you're back to fundamental meaninglessness. There's no reason to do anything. Nothing you could do would ever make a difference. And there's no hope for anything anyways. So as long as we are aware of that and going to be consistent with it, then we're on that track of truth that I think is well modeled within the Christian tradition of, yes, we're screwing things up. Yes, we're ignorant, but we do things and they have significant effects. And so we need to come to terms with that. We need to come to terms that we've messed things up. We need to come to terms with what the reality of the good is and that we're not currently on its side. And then we need to reform and become on its side. So that means this, I think, it's an interesting and deep pattern to notice. And I think it's hopeful once you actually realize that this is inevitable. This is just part of reality. But in addition to that, it also provides us with this hope, with this reality that what you realize then, even though we're so ignorant, even though we are fallible and we're going to mess things up, and even though we're effective, and so we're making powerful causation, we're putting powerful causes into the world that are not properly oriented, so we're doing damage. Yes. Then you sort of get confronted by the idea of like, well, we have to know the good. Like, how could we possibly understand what is good? Because we're so ignorant and life's a mystery. And so there's no way for us to come to know the good. Well, that's getting a step ahead of ourselves, because that's looking for like this full comprehensive view of what goodness looks like lived out. But what we all agree on, what we all know intuitively and operate by, is that searching for and coming into contact with and coming to know the truth is in itself good. That must be a good, because the truth is what causes us or gives us the opportunity to change and to come into contact with good. So in itself, our search for, our pursuit of the truth is good. So we don't have to wonder, how do I do a good thing when I don't know what the good is? We do know what step one is. We do know what foundation of goodness number one is, that everything else is built off of. Figure out the truth. Find the truth. The truth in itself and your search for it are goods in themselves. So I think that's extremely profound and extremely helpful, in that we are all immediately able to embark upon the path of goodness, and that's the search for the truth. So let's do that, and then we're already doing good.
I think that's an incredible point. I think of, what time frame are we in? Like you could look at, those that were alive during World War II might have a little more of a pessimistic outlook on humanity in general. Though, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, I mean, of course, there were some issues going on, but I mean, in relation to World War II, things were better. I mean, of course, there were definitely a lot of things going wrong in that time period, and you can find those. But I'll make the analogy of looking at a specific stock chart. If you're going through a difficult time on the daily, on the hourly, the daily, or the weekly, and that's all you're consumed with, and it's bearish, it's going down, you can make a case by just looking at those charts and say, okay, well, humanity's bearish. It's not good. Things are going bad. But if you zoom out on the macro, it's macro bullish. It's if you look at humanity as a whole, we're not sacrificing anymore. Sure, some people are doing that, but in general, humanity is not doing that. We're not cannibals. Um, we're not doing things that we've grown out of through causation, through realizing certain things are wrong and we shouldn't do it, and then we grow out of it and we begin to prosper. And we, I think, have a natural tendency to drive towards abundance and prosperity and that search for the truth, even though there are many, many, many pockets of downtrends where we're going through extremely hellacious times. And so if we're focused on that, it's like if you watch the news all the time. So fear sells. So if you're watching the news all the time and that's your perception of the world, it's going to be negative because 99% of the information on the news is negative to get people to watch. But if you are able to change, what content that you're ingesting uh, to more good things, then your perception, your perspective on life is going to shift into that, humanity is naturally uh, um, tended towards being good, has a tendency to be drawn to that. So I think that's a really big one that people I think don't look at. We look at the specific time that we're in and we say, okay, you know, there's some really bad stuff going on in the world. I mean, we could spend hours talking about it. Um, but then there are also some incredible things. I mean, we could go in a shower right now and hot water comes out and we can clean ourselves. We're in climate controlled rooms. Incredible. What a
Yes.
and yeah, it's incredible time to be alive. You can turn a faucet and get fresh water. Uh, so and I think gratitude comes in line with that. A sense of unfulfillment or lack or the glass is half empty, I think breeds kind of that pessimism and thought that there is no meaning that certain things are you're focusing on the bad, what things are missing as opposed to looking at the things that we have. And if you zoom out on all that, I mean, we are in incredible times, and I think the story of humanity is naturally good. It has a tendency to gravitate towards the goodness and that search uh for truth. Now, I did want to bring up you talk a lot about towards the end of the chapter the importance of integrity. Where does that lie in kind of that overarching story of seeking the truth and looking at the good in humanity?
Yeah, I think in terms of integrity, the idea and truth, the idea that there's a universal truth is it play it goes hand in hand with that. I think if you believe in sort of a local, just my truth, then integrity sort of has no meaning because I can be consistent with what I believe, but nobody else really understands what that pattern is and why I'm doing the things I'm doing. So I think that, and this is what I talk about in the chapter, I think there's a good case to be made, and a couple people have made similar cases, one being Jonathan Haidt and one being that I just read, um, Tom Holland in his book Dominion, uh, that the idea of God was sort of the driving force behind the development of integrity cross culturally. So, um, Jonathan Haidt talks about some studies that have shown and proposed that there are underlying necessities that have to be in place in order for integrity to develop, in order for honest truth seeking to develop. And he shows that those things are met by the idea of an omnipotent God who cares about your behavior. And then I would say I take it a step further in showing how drastic that would be for someone at the time of, say, Abraham, rather than later in the Bible once Israel as a nation is established. Because once Israel's established, and you have the full law and the society of Israel commingling, then they have a lot less incentive to interact positively beyond their own borders, because then they think, well, we're doing the right things that God told us to do, and we're the special people, and so we can just dismiss those heathens. Not that that's what the Bible says to do, but you can see that's how Israel sort of took it. But when you are a stranger in a strange land, when you are alone trying to start your own way, like Abraham was, and all you have is your faith in God and your knowledge that He is supreme and that He cares about your behavior and He expects certain things of you, then you're going to have much more of the attitude of positive relations, regardless of the makeup of the local people. So I think that this and Tom Holland sort of takes the other side, but I think it reveals the same mechanism, because he makes the case that religions developed syncretism, which is to say, like, people in Greece decided that the Egyptian god, whatever, uh, I can't think of the name right now, but one of the Egyptian gods was the same as their god Apollo, and so that they sort of syncretized their religions and said we're talking about the same thing, and that was extended that understanding across their borders. Whereas before they would just be insular, and they would believe in abiding by respect of other people worshiping their god, but not really caring about people beyond their borders. So he proposes syncretism as a way to bridge that gap, but I think it's also done, and I think more effectively, by the idea that there is a universal God who oversees all actions and cares about all people. So, so in any case, I think his acknowledgement that that would serve that purpose proves that that kind of thing serves that purpose. So it would necessarily be true then of the universal God as well. So this idea of integrity, I think, comes out of that view of a universal God or a universal truth, that there is a universal aspect of, there's a unitary aspect to infinite reality, and it has a personality, a will, and a consciousness that interests it in how we interact with causation, as we're called to, and how we interact with other people who are also called to partake of universal causality. So this idea is sort of, at least if you take an evolutionary lens, you could very easily construct the argument that this was sort of the seed of integrity, and the way to build effective communities. And then now we look at it today, like, okay, that's all ancient history, but we're in a time where people are losing trust in each other. And so the requirements that Jonathan Haidt talks about in order for a social system to adopt accountability and engage with exploratory efforts for the truth, you need to have, he's quoting Phil Tetlock, but he says you need to have the explicit expectation that one will be called upon to justify one's beliefs, feelings, or actions to others, coupled with the expectation that people will reward or punish us based on how well we justify ourselves. And he continues, accountability, that's what he was just describing, like, that's accountability. You're accountable for your actions, you're accountable for your judgments, for your feelings, and how you acted on them, and how well you say, this is what I was thinking at the time, and this is why I did what I did. Now, you need that in society, but accountability only increases exploratory thought when an additional three conditions apply. Number one is that decision makers, people who are making decisions, learn before forming any opinion that they will be accountable to an audience. So they know that they're going to be judged. The audience's views are unknown because if they know the views, then they'll just formulate their position to appeal to that audience. And then they believe the audience to be well informed and interested in accuracy. So they believe the audience to be introduced in truth. When all of those apply, people do their darndest to figure out the truth because that's what the audience wants to hear. Or at least that's the best bet, is to try and figure out the truth, try and state it clearly. So the reason why I went through all that is that just as we saw that it worked, it at least could have worked in principle in the time of Abraham, it can definitely work now. Now we've sort of lost a lot of the ideas. We've lost a lot of that religious social structure that would give sort of like Israel had the idea that we're just this insular community and we look down on other people. But we have a lot of people who are just sort of adrift and societies are breaking down. But if we restore the idea of a universal God, then we come to the point where we are fulfilling those requirements. People start to believe that God is desiring something of them. They're going to need to account for it. He knows, and that we can't manipulate him. We can't pretend that we were doing what he wants us to do. Like he knows better than us. So I think this, regardless of the historicity of whether that's exactly how it happened, whether it happened on the evolutionary model or not, the reality is that today, in order to restore social trust and social integration, we need integrity. We need to act in ways that are consistent, that are predictable to other people, that are that take into account other people, that are ethical. And if we feel that we're genuinely going to be held account to that by an all-knowing God, then that's going to be a great thing to influence that growth of integrity and to bring that about. So I think that, and it's sort of an infinite backstop, really. Like you can't undermine it. So as long as there's that belief in God, you are going to be called to act with integrity.
Yeah, I mean, I always view integrity as being a strong backbone for truth, and like you're saying, it allows one to be consistent. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about with works. So if I only do the works where people can see it, but then when I'm in the shadows, I do the opposite of the works. It's living in falsehood. That's not aligned with truth. It's like if I were to say, Rob, I'm going to give up ice cream. I mean, I'm not going to do that. But if I say, hey, Rob, I'm going to give up ice cream. And then as soon as we end this conversation, I go and have ice cream. The next time we talk and you say, hey, Steven, you eat an ice cream? And I say, no, that not only is that a lie and is that a falsehood, but that it hurts the spirit to do that because I know I'm living in falsehood. I know that I'm not being integrous with my word or my actions. I know that it's not,
It also degrades our relationship.
and it degrades our relationship because I'm lying, right? So it's really important, and it kind of leads into that consistency in that what we do in the light is the same thing as we do in the shadows. And God sees both. He sees what we do in the light and he sees what we do in the shadows. And if you're consistent, you remain consistent with that, not only does that align ethically with uncovering and upholding the truth, but then that ties also in with faith, because if you are not living in integrity, you're doing the opposite of what you do in the shadows is what you do in the light, then to me that completely is disassociated from faith. Because if you're engaging in poor behavior in the shadows while thinking, okay, as long as I'm faithful and I uphold what I believe God wants me to do, then I will achieve, I will have salvation. But you know in your heart, and God knows that if you act without integrity in the shadows, that completely nullifies and voids the whole kit and caboodle, because you're not
Right.
you're doing the exact opposite. So
Well,
um
it means you're worshiping the and trying to sacrifice to like social perception. You're not actually worshiping God. You are putting all your chips in on just controlling how the public sees you and not worrying about anything else.
Exactly. And again, that ties in with the whole work situation and how potentially superficial that could be if you're just trying to appease the community and society, and a false sense of self, as opposed to living in that integrity and living in truth. And by living in truth, you're being faithful, and hopefully you can receive the grace of the Lord by doing that. So it all ties together. Um, Rob, is there anything else that you wanted to go over in this chapter before we conclude?
No, I think that covers it.
Excellent. Excellent conversation as always, Rob. So the book is Purpose Informed, the necessary basis of all ethics. You can find this book on Amazon. If you I will leave a link in the description down below where you can get your copy, or if you go to amazon.com, you can find the book if you search for Purpose Informed with Rob's name, Rob B. Davis II, Robert B. Davis II. It will come up. Also, you can find Rob's other works at his website, which I will also leave in the link down below, link in the description down below. If you have any questions or comments that we could bring up in the next chapter, or that we can answer in our next video, please feel free to do that. The next chapter is going to be called Metaphysics of Mind. That's going to be a doozy. And I think it's another longer chapter, is it not?
I don't know.
I don't know. Either way, it's going to be a good one. Um, well, it's been a great conversation, Rob. I hope you have a great night. And for everybody else, God bless and may peace be with you.